Hello everyone, it's Dr. Sam Hurst. This is the 20th in our series of the October Gothic A Day Tempts the Vampires to Stay, which means that we are about 2/3 of the way through. As usual, I'll be introducing a text, giving you some idea of why it's important, and also giving you some further reading recommendations. Now, today we're sticking in the 19th century, and we're also sticking with female ghost story writers, in part because women were so important in this sort of popularity and popularization of the ghost story in the period. I'm going to be talking about a writer today who you've probably heard of, although you might know her more from the television adaptations of her novels. Now, I'm of course talking about Elizabeth Gaskell, and the story we're going to look at today is The Old Nurse's Tale from 1852. But you'll probably know her from her novels, for example, North and South, Cranford, Wives and Daughters, all of which have very popular and very good television adaptations of them. Now, Elizabeth Gaskell was writing in the Victorian period. She was a fairly prolific writer and wrote not only novels, but a variety of short stories. Now, a number of these dealt with the supernatural. Some of them, such as The Old Nurse's Tale, were ghost stories proper. Others of them dwelt on ancestral curses, such as the doom of the Griffiths, and yet more cross the boundaries between personal curses and witchcraft, such as the Poor Clare. You'll also find ones where there is a reveal of villainy, such as the Squire's Story, which is all about that sort of terror and horror and sensation, but not so much about the ghosts. So those are my reading recommendations if you're wanting to get into Gaskell a little bit more. And of course, I do recommend her novels, particularly my favourite, North and South. Now, Elizabeth Gaskell was based for quite a while in Manchester. So she can be classed, even though she wasn't necessarily born there, as a Manchester writer and more broadly as a northern writer. Now, Elizabeth Gaskell was writing similarly to Dickens, in a sense, in a way which incorporated depictions and discussions of the lower classes, the working class, and also issues of social justice. Questions arise in North and South, for example, about trade unionists and conditions of work in the factories. And all of this was very much tied to Gaskell's own life and the fact that she was married to a Unitarian minister in Manchester and was known or would know of the work done with the poor in the area. Now, we might not agree with some of her opinions today, but she definitely does try to incorporate a fuller picture of society in her work. The story that we're talking about today, The Old Nurse's Tale, is narrated by the nursemaid. And it bears some similarity to perhaps the more famous tale that you will have heard of The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. Now, not necessarily in terms of plot, but certainly in terms of setting. The idea of this move into a country house in the north of England where there is a ghostly haunting past which threatens those inside. Now, the nursemaid tells the tale of having to move there with her young charge. And in the house, there are various unexplained circumstances. The most supernatural of which is the organ which plays at night, though everybody wants to deny it. The house is inhabited only by 2 elderly ladies and the staff, and there is some sorrow overhanging these old ladies. But we don't quite know what it is. There's some mystery. We later find out that it's a mystery of a wrong done in the past. 2 sisters in love with the same man, one triumphant, secretly married with a secret child, the other filled with jealousy and waiting for her opportunity to reveal the secret, which has tragic consequences for everybody. The ghosts return, trying to tempt the young child out onto the moor at night. They're thankfully not successful. But the story ends with a bang, the reappearance of the old man, a rerunning of the past incident. Now, what's always interesting to me about this story is obviously this move into the house as the source of threat and intergenerational trauma, but also the depiction that Elizabeth Gaskell has of the north of England. What we quite often find in this Victorian period is this othering of the north, both internally from people like the Brontes, who are depicting their own area as this sort of other liminal space on the border of the wild. But then there's people like Elizabeth Gaskell, a northern writer, but also one creating the northern countryside, areas such as Yorkshire and Cumbria, as these spaces on the border of the supernatural, on the border of the untamed and the savage. And it's a sort of interesting comparison with the Brontes. It's also interesting because Elizabeth Gaskell, of course, wrote a biography of Charlotte Bronte in which she performed a kind of geographical apologetics, explaining the Brontes by reference to the countryside and the society in which they lived. So if you're wanting to get an idea of this othering of the north from the perspective of a northern person who's still quite engaged in this othering, then Elizabeth Gaskell is a good choice and a great read. Enjoy.